Hello and welcome to The Rundown, a podcast from PoliticsHome. I'm your host, Alain Tolhurst. With me to discuss the big stories this week is my colleague Adam Payne. I'm delighted to say we're joined by the former Work and Pension Secretary, Chloe Smith. So, Adam, we'll start with you. Just go through what's been happening this week. I think it's been overshadowed, really, by a big row over the appointment and eventual resignation of Gavin Williamson and kind of questions over the Prime Minister's judgement, really, in not just appointing Williamson, but also in dealing with these allegations that we've seen. And I think it's kind of brought together lots of wider conversations, really, about how whipping works and how people talk to each other in Westminster. We'll come on to later as well. And also, there's been some big news in Northern Ireland that you've been covering as well. So what have been kind of your takeaways this week so far?
Well, so taking it chronologically, I guess. Well, when you were sat here last week, Alain, the conversation was about another individual. It was about Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. A week on, we're talking about another individual. However, this one has actually left government, Gavin Williamson. And in the end, Gavin Williamson resigned from his rather nebulous role in the Cabinet Office.
Oh, no, he was in charge of the Geospatial Commission.
Of course, and the Great campaign.
Yes.
But he resigned from his position, saying that the allegations regarding his conduct over the last few years in various roles in government were distracting from Rishi Sunak's new premiership. And there were two allegations in particular. Firstly, well, the first isn't really an allegation. We've seen the hard evidence of messages he sent to Wendy Morton a few weeks ago when she was the chief whip. Of course, that's a role that he's done before. And secondly, there was a report in The Guardian by Pippa Creer reporting allegations about pretty awful things he allegedly said to a civil servant when he was Defence Secretary. And these two separate allegations, these claims, did lead to formal processes, formal investigations. And by that point, when was it? Was it on
Tuesday night?
Tuesday night that Gavin Williamson tweeted his letter of resignation. And what was interesting, and I guess this leads on to conversations about Rishi Sunak's political judgement, which is something that's under the political spotlight at the moment. In his response to Williamson, he said he was very sad to lose him, didn't he? And to lose his loyalty. And the tone of that letter raised some eyebrows, I think, given the nature of the conduct that Williamson is alleged to have done. And then just touching quickly on Northern Ireland, what's happened. I mean, Northern Ireland is never the sexiest issue in politics, but it's absolutely an important one. The Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, announced yesterday in the House of Commons that the plan the government did have to hold a fresh election in Northern Ireland, because, of course, Northern Ireland has been without a functioning government since February.
Yeah.
That's
the power sharing executive.
Exactly. That's due to the DUP's refusal to form a government over their opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the plan was to hold an election before Christmas, in the run-up to Christmas. Essentially, everyone in Northern Ireland thought that was a terrible idea and had been urging Downing Street to think again. So Downing Street has thought again. And Heaton-Harris announced yesterday that deadline for holding an election has been pushed back initially 6 weeks, which means that when you factor in the length of the election period, blah, 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 we're looking at an election happening in Northern Ireland in early March. However, if by then the government feels the conditions aren't there for an election, i.e. the DUP still aren't going to play ball, then they will have the power to action another 6-week extension, which means we're looking at an election in Northern Ireland on April 13th. Now, why is that date significant? It's significant because I believe it's 3 days after the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So clearly that's going to be a momentous moment in the calendar. President Biden is expected to be visiting Northern Ireland at the time. So the government, really, reading between the lines, is banking on finally getting a deal with the EU on the protocol before spring 2023.
Yeah, they don't want to go past that date without
Exactly.
having one. Just going back to where we are bringing Chloe in, obviously, I just wonder what you'd made of the Williamson round. Do you think it was right that he resigned on Tuesday?
I think it's extremely disappointing. It's not, I don't think, the kind of standards that we would want to demonstrate in politics, or that people would want to work within in a professional workplace. So I think it's right that he's gone. And I also think it's a really good opportunity for the Prime Minister, for Rishi, to be able to do rightly what he set out, that he's looking for the standards, the highest standards of professionalism and integrity. And I think that would be to the benefit of politics overall. None of this is helpful for democracy and for the reputation of the House of Commons. Great swathes of this are a kind of throwback to sort of House of Cards days, aren't they? And I mean that in the British sense, not the American sense. In other words, quite a few decades ago. And we don't need that. I think this is a really good opportunity for Rishi to move us on and into an age where we can demonstrate better in politics.
Mm. Yeah, we'll circle back to the actual kind of situation around Williamson. I just wondered, you obviously entered the House, you were the baby of the House when you entered it back in 2009. What were your kind of experiences then as a woman in her 20s, entering the House of Commons? Did you feel that it was sort of an intimidating environment? Do you think it's got better over the years? What are your kind of experiences of a lot of stuff that we're hearing about, that kind of those, as you say, that kind of Francis Urquhart, dark arts kind of behaviour?
Well, no negative experiences, actually, I must say. I mean, the Chief Whip that I first joined the parliamentary party with was Patrick McLaughlin, who I've always had the hugest respect for, and I think many others do as well. So I'm glad to say I had nothing negative to report in that sense. And indeed, I rapidly joined the Whip's office myself. And actually, if you forgive me a little personal reflection, I mean, one of the 13 years on, I'm able to say that actually I was one of the longest serving ministers. I think I've been one of the very few left who actually served in government in 2010. That's a very long span of record. And also on the women point, here's a little statistic that I came across recently. There are, on the Conservative benches, there are 6 remaining women who were in Parliament from before 2010. And that's in illustrious company, from Theresa May through 5 other colleagues to me. And all of us now sit either as deputy speakers or as members of the Privy Council. So that's a very lovely club to be part of. But, looking at that span of history, I think it's been an incredibly tumultuous time in politics, obviously. Arguably, really, I think from 2016 onwards, to be fair, and all of us, you and me together have lived through quite a lot of professionally testing times, right? Either as journalists or as elected politicians. And what we need are those standards,
Yeah, and I just wondered, obviously, like you say, you've seen it from the other side as well. You were in the Whip's office early on in your career, and then you went back to Whip's office, I believe, in 2017 as well. How did you see it from that side? Like, there's criticism of the way, perhaps, that sort of heavy-handedness. Did you notice any difference in your 2 stints in the Whip's office? Well,
in actual fact, my 2017 stint was more focused on being a Northern Ireland minister.
Right.
I was principally a Northern Ireland minister with a small responsibility in the Whip's office. So perhaps we might save that to use under the second item of chat.
Indeed.
But no, I didn't have any. I have no personal experiences to add to the story in terms of the Whip's office.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just one other thing on that. Like, obviously, some MPs have perhaps sought to minimise, some of the Williamson texts. I saw George Eustice saying that actually, it shouldn't have gone to a formal complaint, that it should have just been a phone call and that sort of stuff. And people saying it's been blown up out of proportion. But when I speak to people outside of politics, they say, look, there's just no way you can speak to people like that. Do you think that there's perhaps sometimes a disconnect between the rough and tumble of Westminster and actually people outside of politics? Do you think that you just shouldn't really speak to people in that kind of way?
I think, unfortunately, sometimes sometimes in politics you do find people who think that we're special, and there's a kind of exceptionalism occasionally about things in Westminster. We're very conscious of working in a hugely historical and very privileged institution. And sorry, when I say privileged, I mean an institution in which it's a privilege to work is what I actually mean by that.
Yeah.
And so, and so sometimes it can be tempting to think that, there are different rules in Westminster, but it should not be like that. Really what we are looking at here, I think, is a clear case of simply the standards that we would all wish to live and work by. And I think, I think it's right that this particular case has shown what the better path is.
Yeah, sure.
I was just sort of reflecting on Gavin Williamson, because he played a key role in helping Theresa May and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak get into Downing Street. He's been a pretty sort of central character to the soap opera that has been British politics over the last few years. He has this aura around him. I remember a few years ago there were suggestions he could sort of plot his way to being Prime Minister.
Right,
he had this kind of Machiavellian...
All the stories about him
mythology,
having a sword or having a pet tarantula Cronus in his office, that sort of stuff.
But now I've been speaking to Tory MPs this week, and this might be partly because there are so many new Tory MPs now who were elected in 2019 due to the nature of that victory 3 years ago, that sort of aura might have rubbed off now, and that perhaps he isn't as popular and indeed as feared as he may have been a few years ago. I'm just interested, Chloe, on your reflections on sort of the Gavin Williamson phenomenon. Like, what's your assessment of him as a political operator? And also, it kind of feels like now that he's left government, it doesn't feel like he's going to get back in there anytime soon. But perhaps a hostage to fortune.
Wouldn't put it past him.
But Chloe, I'd be interested to hear your reflections just on Gavin Williamson, his sort of role. How is he actually regarded in the parliamentary Tory party?
Well, I'm going to be sorry to disappoint you here. I'm not going to indulge in personal gossip. The truth is, of course, actually, he may have left government, but he's still a colleague and is still a human being. So I'm not going to, add more to it, here and now. But I think, as I was already saying, I really do think, that here is an opportunity to reflect actually on some behaviour that appears to have been uncovered, and that offers a sort of parting of the ways. Let's take the correct path here, because we don't need to put on display to the British people, another version of Westminster behaving badly. We've got a job to do, and I think actually most colleagues' opinion at this stage would be to get on with that job.
Yeah. Well, in terms of kind of fixing that, there's an element of this story that's been kind of a misogyny angle, I suppose. Do you think that there is still an issue around misogyny in Westminster? We've covered stuff before on the podcast around harassment and that sort of stuff. Do you think there is an issue? Obviously, you might mention those Tory MPs who are women, but actually your party still, less than 30% of its MPs are women still. Do you think there's more work to be done around that? And do you think your party's maybe still got a bit of an issue around misogyny? Is that part of the way of improving kind of the standards within Parliament?
The Conservative Party does not have an issue with misogyny. The Conservative Party has had 3 women prime ministers where others are still lagging. Allow me just to slam dunk that point while I can. I think the truth is that actually politics on any part of the spectrum is all the richer for having a diversity of people. And in fact, this, you gave me the opportunity to mention earlier on about being a young MP at the time. I've always made this point that actually you need young people, you need old people, you need men, you need women, you absolutely need all walks of life in Parliament so that it reflects the people that we serve, and that will be to its strength. So there's always more to do on that, and I think the Conservative Party actually has a great record on that. But there's much more to do to make sure that we're doing that job for people, which you do by means of being able to reflect back British society.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, the questions around kind of how Rishi Sunak has dealt with it and moving on. He said he wanted to lead a government of integrity. I just wondered what you'd kind of made of how Sunak had dealt with probably his first kind of big political sort of crisis as Prime Minister.
Well, I don't want to give too much away because I'm writing about this for the weekend, so I don't want to...
Read about it in our special email on Saturday morning.
I don't want to sort of jeopardise myself, but clearly it's not ideal for Rishi Sunak that in the first few weeks of his premiership, and also a premiership which was meant to be such a clean break from what's come before, a fresh start. You talked about integrity, accountability, all those very sort of positive abstract nouns. For it to be not dominated, but for the Suella, Braverman and the Gavin Williamson stuff to be big news stories during that time, probably the biggest news stories.
Yeah.
Because until we've got the autumn statement next week, which I'm sure we'll touch upon in a few moments. Until that point, the government hasn't really announced anything. We won't get a really clear sense of the direction we're going in terms of tax and spend and whatnot until next week. And look, there are multiple ways of looking at it, right? So in the end, Gavin Williamson has gone.
Yeah.
There are still questions, as you reported, Alain, last night. There are still questions in regards to what Rishi Sunak knew about those complaints, etc., etc. Perhaps the tone of his letter was strange, but ultimately, Gavin Williamson's gone.
Yeah.
He's gone. Some MPs I've spoken to have said that perhaps the last 2 weeks have raised questions about Rishi Sunak's political judgement Although he is a big beast of the Tory party, obviously he's Prime Minister, he's still relatively new to... I mean, he was elected, in 2015? Which feels like a lifetime ago now, given what's happened in between. But he's not, he's not a veteran of the House of Commons. And speaking to Tory MPs this week, they have suggested that perhaps elements of how the Braverman and Williamson affairs have been handled indicate political inexperience.
Yeah, a bit of naivety, maybe.
Perhaps a bit of naivety. But ultimately, I think the real big test for Sunak will come next week with the autumn statement.
Yeah.
There's no doubt, and we discussed this at length in recent podcasts, that Westminster, I think Chloe, I'm sure will agree, Westminster just feels more calm at the moment. We've said I'd gotten so used to Westminster being in crisis and governments falling that adjusting to this period of relative stability has actually been quite weird. But if it does feel calm now, I think next week when we get announcements on tax and spend, when we get announcements on which things are being maintained, but perhaps more pertinently, which things are being cut, when we get announcements around foreign aid, for example, I think that's when we're going to, one, get a clearer sense of the direction of this government, but two, a clearer sense of where the fights are going to be, where the backbenches are going to be restless. And I think that is going to be the big test of Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, I think Chloe kind of moving away from that kind of personality politics to actually what the government wants to be able to do. Obviously, you were Work and Pension Secretary over the summer. The big discussion at the moment is about how benefits are uprated. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. There's a lot of people in the party are very excised about this and want the government to make sure that they make that guarantee on benefits. Was that something that you were looking at? Was there kind of work ongoing in that before you left the department last month?
Yes, this was something I was looking at. And of course, the actual background here is that it's a statutory review that the Secretary of State conducts of both pensions and benefits in terms of uprating, and that happens every autumn. So obviously, yes, I had the early stages of that work, and Mel Stride, who I wish well, will be finishing that. And I think it's already been made clear that that's going to culminate ready for the 17th, so ready for Thursday. I mean, the clear principle that you have to go into this with is how to protect the most vulnerable. That is what the state pension does, and that is what the benefit system does. And so, that's an absolute kind of foundational principle, and it's certainly one that I was applying. And again, it's one that I'm glad that Mel and Rishi have also spoken about and emphasised. That's really important. But of course, they've actually got a very tough set of decisions that they need to bring together. That is but one of a very tough set of decisions. I can't preempt what they will decide, obviously, but I think it is right that they try to blend that principle of supporting the most vulnerable with the fiscal sustainability and the stability in the public finances that is going to be needed in order to create a strong economy that endures and supports everybody.
Yeah, do you think it's a retrievable situation? A lot of people suggesting that that the party's in a very difficult position. It's miles behind Labour in some of the polls. There's a big moment, I suppose, for Sunak and his administration. What are you kind of looking for, apart from, as we touched on the stuff on benefits, what else are you kind of looking for to really kind of kickstart the economy and also kickstart, I guess, the Conservatives in terms of taking on Starmer and Labour as we lead towards an election in a couple of years' time?
Well, for me, I mean, the golden thread that actually has run through all of the sequence of Conservative government has been jobs and the economy. And, that was personally a huge priority for me in the role that I was, very honoured to be able to play for a short while. And I think continues to be for actually all colleagues in the Conservative team. And so therefore, what I'm really looking for out of the autumn statement is a way that we can have stability in the public finances, that we can get debt falling, but that we can continue to look towards growth, because actually that is what supports ordinary people, creates opportunity for people, and that's what I think will demonstrate what you can look to Conservatives in government for.
Yeah, I think the problem is that obviously the kind of gamble on growth was a big part of what Kwasi Kwarteng tried to do with his fiscal statement earlier in the autumn, and obviously things kind of backfired slightly because obviously the government was having to also spend lots of money on things like the energy. Do you think that it is possible to tread that fine line, or do you think that it is the situation we find ourselves in economically, that it is going to be very difficult to chase growth at the same time as protecting the vulnerable as well?
I think it is possible to achieve this balance. Yes, I do. I mean, in terms of Kwasi, obviously. Liz, the former Prime Minister, had actually been very clear that actually overall there were things there that were trying to go too far and too fast, and I think that's been accounted for and explained and apologised for. But the point really then, looking forward, is that we've got some major challenges in the economy that were pre-existing. That may have been brought to a head recently, but actually that were absolutely underlying and that are shared globally. And prime amongst those is inflation. And I think it's actually really welcome that that Rishi has made clear that is one of his number one focuses to get a grip on inflation, because that is what then drives the anxiety and painful impacts that we see on particularly on the most vulnerable, but actually throughout society and throughout the economy. So it's right that that's his focus.
Yes, I mean, Alain, kind of said I enjoyed your description of the mini budget as backfired slightly.
Well, I mean,
the understatement of the year. But what I think is interesting, right? A sign that next week's autumn statement is a big moment and is going to contain difficult decisions is the fact that this week I'm told that Rishi has been hosting lots of Tory MPs in Downing Street.
Yeah.
I know an MP who was there last night. I know a former cabinet minister who's there the night before. I'm not sure, Chloe, if you've been invited or indeed if you've gone along for a drink. But to me, that's a sign that Downing Street is rolling the pitch.
Yeah,
is probably briefing these MPs on the flavour of what's to come, because it isn't going to be the most feel good. Come by our
Jeremy Hunt's talked about difficult decisions.
Yeah, there's going to be stuff in there which it's going to be tough to swallow for a lot of Tory MPs, and I think that's certainly a reason why the Prime Minister has been engaging in all of this outreach this week. Have you been there, Chloe, this week, Downing Street?
Well, I was certainly invited, and I would have been delighted to go, but I can confess that actually it was my wedding anniversary.
Oh, congratulations!
One of the advantages of being fired from cabinet is you get to spend more time with your family, and so I thought I'd better do that.
But yeah, do you think that there's, as Adam says, like the sort of rolling of the pitch? We go back to again the Truss and Kwarteng kind of era. There was criticism that perhaps MPs hadn't been properly prepared for it, and it was difficult for them to go out and discuss it. And do you think that Sunak maybe has understood that, and therefore I think also as well perhaps the party is perhaps more willing to go along with this stuff because they know how important it is that this goes right, because if this goes wrong then there really is no coming back for it, I suppose.
I think Conservative colleagues are absolutely dedicated to doing the right thing for their constituents, and it is clear, absolutely clear, that what everybody needs here is economic stability in order to then be able to build people's lives and livelihoods upon. And that is what I know Rishi and Jeremy Hunt will be seeking to achieve on Thursday. As we've all said, that they have some extremely tough decisions ahead of them, which they will be looking to bring together in a package that really rises to these global challenges. I mean, again, it's really worth emphasising. Actually, most countries around the world are facing challenges just like this. You look at interest rates, and of course, there's been moves both in, for example, Europe and in America that are, broadly similar to what we're having to do here. To what the bank is doing here. And then in terms of inflation, again, the challenges are the same across many countries.
Do you think that maybe there's been a problem that obviously there's double-digit inflation in lots of places and interest rates are going to have to go up? Do you think there's been a problem maybe then that the Conservatives have allowed themselves to be blamed for that? And essentially, do you think there should have been a better job in explaining that this is an issue that everyone's facing, that people's mortgages were going to have to go up regardless, as the era of cheap money is perhaps kind of over, and it's global pressures that have led to it. But it does feel as though now, especially Labour, the way trying to paint it in this way, that people's mortgages are going to go up as a result of Conservative policies, and actually that it's not necessarily the government's fault or entire fault behind that, but perhaps they're going to be blamed for it as we go forward.
Well, I mean, I think the Labour Party is simply wrong and misguided to paint it that way. It's just not the case. These are global issues. I mean, a really emblematic reason for that I think most people can see and understand really clearly is that it's Putin's invasion in Ukraine. I mean, that has had the key impact on commodity prices and therefore from there through the rest of the economy. But it's also the case, I mean, and again, as Rishi has himself reflected, that we have to be able to think about what was spent during the COVID pandemic, and we have to be able to account for that. This is what responsible governments have to do, and I'm fully behind him in doing so.
Do you think, Adam, that what's kind of the key block in stopping this kind of happening? And do you think there is a chance that things will get right, or do you think that there's a real push to try and get things sorted out before we hit that kind of big the big kind of Good Friday anniversary next year?
Look, we've been here so many times before that I can almost feel the PTSD coming on as I'm saying this. But when you speak to people on the UK and the EU side, they both say the mood is really good. It's in the best place it's been in for quite some time. Actually, it's worth saying Rishi Sunak today, Thursday, is at the British-Irish Council Summit.
Yeah.
And he's the first PM to do this since Gordon Brown in 2007. He's due to meet with his Irish counterparts, with the leaders of devolved nations today. And it sounds like, this is very sort of technical, but a big part of this disagreement over the protocol is the EU claims that the UK hasn't given the EU sufficient access to all the data which it uses to track movements from GB to NI.
Yeah.
It sounds like the EU now feels like it has got the data it needs to take a look kind of under the bonnet and to see how it's all working. If the EU is happy with that, that could potentially unlock an agreement on customs, which is a big part of this impasse. It sounds like things are moving.
Yeah.
It sounds like I've heard late this year, early next, we could finally have an agreement on this, which obviously, since its implementation early 2020, has really bedeviled relations between the EU and the UK.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, if there is a revised protocol, if there is a deal, does the DUP feel it's acceptable? Do they feel that it's enough for them to get back into power sharing? If it does, if Geoffrey Donaldson and his colleagues feels that way, then hopefully we have the executive back up and running in time for spring, and that 25th anniversary of the peace deal and Biden's visit clearly will be a really fantastic celebratory moment. If the DUP still isn't happy and still refuses to get into government, then we are in a bit of a predicament, to put it lightly. We are going to be in a constitutional crisis. So I think the weeks leading up to Christmas are going to be really important, I think. And what I would say with that is that, going back to Sunak's appearance today at the summit, I think there is a feeling that this government, and indeed the Truss government, to be honest, took real steps to improve relations with the EU.
Yeah.
That really, I remember when we were at Conservative conference, God, feels like a long time ago, in Birmingham, speaking to EU representatives who were there, they were all talking about this improved mood.
Yeah. Chloe, have you felt a sense of that? I know that obviously Steve Baker as Northern Ireland Minister and Heaton Harris as Northern Ireland Secretary have got a lot of outreach work. Do you get a sense that the mood music is a bit better, and do you think there is a chance to kind of fix some of these problems as we go into the winter?
Yes, I certainly hope there is, and that is the way to go about doing it. I mean, I commend them for that work. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's it remains just a massive disappointment that the parties in Northern Ireland have not been able to agree yet, and to be able to to form government, because actually Northern Ireland politicians ought to be making decisions for Northern Ireland. That's the key principle here, and so I'm very much looking forward to more of those kind of steps being taken to be able to allow that.
And Chloe, you'll be well aware of this from your time working on the brief, but not only does this mean that the people of Northern Ireland are without politicians in Northern Ireland making decisions for them, but it's left an almighty financial black hole in Stormont. They've still got to deliver public services, right? They've still got to deliver things that people need, which is leading to a financial mess. And Heaton Harris, when he was up in the Commons yesterday, said that as part of measures he'd be taking forward to address his financial situation, he'd be cutting the salaries of MLAs, who, for those who don't know, are essentially Northern Ireland's equivalent of MPs, by 27.5%, which is obviously a pretty significant chunk of your salary to lose. But it's another indication of how serious the situation is over there.
Yeah, just one final thing before we wrap up. Northern Ireland, we talked about the autumn statement. There's an awful lot in Rishi Sunak's in-tray. You've, as you say, you were minister in various departments for a long, long time. You're out of cabinet now. How do you assess kind of what his in-tray is like, and what do you think you want to see from him, and what do you think have you seen in him as a person working with him in government? What have you seen that makes you think that he's going to be able to do so into this kind of these difficult periods that he's going into?
Well, I have every good wish for what he will be able to achieve now, and I've seen him able to be diligent, compassionate, creative in what he does in government, and I think that's really important. I think in addition to the major issues we've spoken about today, there's an element of kind of getting back to some basics here, which is people are looking to see success in terms of there being jobs available, there being great education for your kids, there being the health service there when you need it, there being streets safer from crime. And all of those things, of course, are things that we focused on in our manifesto in 2019. And actually, I would say also all those things are things where you've seen progress. For example, in terms of crime, there are more police officers on the streets of my constituency than there were 3 years ago, and that's a token of progress. So I want to see him continuing to make progress on all those points. I think constituents in particular are looking for the backlogs in the NHS to be busted. Dentistry and GPs are, I think, probably top of my constituency mailbag at the moment. And so all those things together are what are in the Prime Minister's in-tray. That job has clearly challenged quite a few people recently. But I think, as you touched on yourselves earlier on, actually, there is an importance now in having a bit less of the excitement, a bit less of, dare I say it, journalists running around on the kind of addiction of turmoil, Am I allowed to gently put fun at you for that? But in all seriousness, there's a massive job to do here. We need to focus on that.
Yeah. Just so you mentioned just a final word. You mentioned all MPs working for their constituents. Just a final word on Matt Hancock in the jungle. Did you watch him on his last night?
Well, no. As aforementioned, it was my wedding anniversary. I was doing something much better.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com. And keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day-a-week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right corner of the website. Thanks to my colleague Adam Payne and our brilliant guest Chloe Smith. Our editor today was Laura Silver. Thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter at PoliticsHome or email us via news@politicshome.com. But for now, I've been Alain Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.